longtime favorite. He's a resident of Pelican Bay, and he annually gives us the most engaging presentations. He already asked me about scheduling it for next year. Dr. Zonies received his MD degree at Northwestern University Medical School, and then he went on to get his internship, residency, fellowships in cardiology and neurology at the Hospital of the University of Pennsylvania. Immediately after getting his PhD, his MD there, he joined the United States Army for 2 years and served 12 months in Vietnam. Dr. Zonies was in private practice as an interventional cardiologist. He told us many times what that meant, for 30 years. Now, since 1998, he hasn't practiced privately, but he's been a consultant to law firms in areas of litigation regarding cardiology. Dealing with disorders of the heart and the circulatory system has come a very, very long way in the 50 years since Dr. Zonies began his practice. And today he's going to tell you how he got there from here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I wanted to put this list back up. These are things that did not exist when I started medical school. So in the days before modern medicine, the art of medicine consisted of amusing the patient while nature provides the cure. But cardiology, modern cardiology, had a long history before of trying to pass the tubes to help people. And these fellows are veterans of what we called, when we were younger, veterans of the Neisseria Wars. Neisseria gonorrhea is the bacteria that causes gonorrhea. And most of the young people in those days, before any antibiotics and things like that, would get narrowing of the urinary outlet. And although that's now a problem for older people in early, all the way back to the Egyptians, most young people had gonorrhea, and they would need to get their urinary bladders relieved. Anyone who's had acute urinary retention knows that that's not much fun. And the Greek word catheter actually meant to let things down or let the urine down, and catheters have been found from societies back to 3000 BC. William Conrad Roentgen produced the first X-ray sort of by accident. He noticed that some photographic paper he had was exposed by this apparatus that was generating X-rays. And he took an X-ray of his wife's hand. And if you go by his house, now in Germany, there's a little plaque on the front of the house that says this is where the first X-ray was performed. It's just near one of the beer halls. Werner Forsman was the first person to put a catheter into a human being. It's a very interesting story. He was a German post-medical school in training. And he got the idea that to treat infections inside the heart, it would be better to deliver whatever drugs they had, none of which worked, of course, but to inside the heart. And so he talked to this Greta Ditson, a nurse who had availability to the locked catheters and instruments needed, scapels and things like that. And he convinced her to be his first patient. And so they gathered the material and they put her on a hospital bed and tied her arms down. Said, don't worry, we'll see how this goes. And then he promptly put out his arm and cut open his left arm and fed the catheter into his heart. You can see it coming up the arm, around the shoulder, and actually it's difficult to see, but it ends all the way down here in the right atrium. And this is the first time a catheter had ever been put in anybody. And he actually walked down to the X-ray department, got this film, and then subsequently catheterized himself many, many times until his veins were all ruined by access. And so now, of course, his mentors and people like that thought he was a little crazy, and he was forbidden to do this anymore. But he shared the Nobel Prize with Andre Beaumont and Dickinson Richards in 1940, who in New York City did the first cardiac catheterizations to measure pressure in the heart, cardiac output, and things like that. So this was the first cardiac cath lab in 1940. Now, this is a slide that I just want to go quickly. What happens is all the blood from the upper part of the body, your head, your arms, etc., comes into this gathering room, right atrium, and then from the legs and liver and stomach comes up from the bottom. And this is the gathering room for blood that has done all of its job throughout the body, and it comes in, and this top part of the heart contracts and moves this blood down through this valve called the tricuspid valve, because it has 3 leaflets, into the right ventricle or main pumping chamber on the right side, and then blood goes out to the lungs through this pulmonary or lung valve. And it comes back, having given up the carbon dioxide and picked up oxygen from the lung, to the left atrium, goes through this mitral valve, which again is here opens. These are like barroom doors. They open passively, and then when this ventricle contracts, it generates a lot of pressure, 140 millimeters, we'll say, and blows open this aortic valve, and all the blood goes out here full of oxygen to make this cycle again and again. So one of the epidemic diseases around the world, still very rare in the United States now, though I saw cases when I was a medical student and saw people who had the disease in my early career, was rheumatic mitral valve disease. The streptococcal infections would cause an inflammation in the mitral valve and sometimes the aortic valve. Now this is the, sorry. This is where all the blood comes back to the heart, and you can see this tricuspid valve, that right-sided valve, is thin. It moves open and closed by pressure, seals tightly, etc. And here's the mitral valve, which should be the same appearance, but it's thickened, very limited in its motion, and there's only a tiny little opening here for the blood to get out of this left atrium when it comes back from the lungs into the main pumping chamber down here. And rheumatic mitral stenosis is still epidemic in the world, but rare in the United States because of antibiotics. So we need somebody to fix these things. And this is the spirit that gets there. My apologies to the heart surgeons who are but the first attempt at fixing this tightened valve here, where you couldn't get blood through it, was by a Dr. Cutler at Massachusetts General Hospital in the 1920s. He took this instrument and put it through the bottom of the heart up into where the valve was and tried to open it, make a hole in it, or make it bigger. His first patient actually did well briefly. The next 6 didn't do well at all, and number 9 did, but that was, they figured, well, that's probably not a good idea. So one of his students, Dwight Hargan, was drafted in World War II. He was posted in London, and he was a chest surgeon, and he was seeing people with chest wounds, a lot of them. And on D-Day, he was presented with a patient with a problem like this, shrapnel. Shrapnel, by the way, was named after a British Major General Shrapnel, who invented the bomb that would burst and throw all these little metal pieces out, called shrapnel. But in any case, he was presented with a patient who had this fragment embedded in the right ventricle of the heart, the front part of the heart. And he went in and put his finger, removed this piece of metal, put his finger in and sewed around it including, imagine the first time he clipped a piece of his glove without knowing it, so that when he went to pull his finger out, it was stuck. So he had to go and cut that part of his glove off and finish the surgery. But it was really forbidden to operate on the heart because no one had successfully been able to close a beating heart, except reputedly one German 25 or 30 years before claimed to have done it. But the secret was that Harkin had done hundreds of operations on large dogs, going into their heart to try to make a disease called endocarditis. And to do that, he would take a safety pin, make it dirty, and go into the dog's heart, put the safety pin on the mitral valve that you saw opening and closing. That would infect the valve, and the dog would have endocarditis. He would then have to go in and open the dog's heart, take the pin out, and try whatever medicine he was going to use. So he'd been in and out of literally hundreds of dog hearts. And he learned that the secret of keeping them from bleeding was to have, suture pledges, where the suture would come, the muscle would be here, and instead of tugging on muscle with this little thin suture, it would be tugging on this pad. And the second thing was to tighten the suture when the heart relaxed, so that it was not contracting and tighten the thing, and then it would be pulling all the time with every time the heart would relax. So he was able to do the 16 men who had fragments in their hearts without losing any of them, and that technique led to further operations on hearts. Charles Bailey was also an Army surgeon. His father died of microstenosis. The symptoms of microstenosis are that the lungs get filled with fluid because that valve doesn't allow the blood to get out of the lungs when it's down. And these people lived a miserable life. They had to sleep sitting up because they couldn't lie flat. Their lungs were filled with fluid. Their livers were swollen. Their extremities were swollen. There were no effective diuretics to get rid of their water. And in the end, they were happy when they got pneumonia and left this world. And he saw his father do this when he was a teenager and decided he was going to do something about these mitral valve narrowings. And he reasoned with Harkin's technique of being able to put your finger in the heart and get out without it bleeding, that he would enter the left atrium, the gathering room from the lungs, and put his finger through and open up the mitral valve, and then remove his finger. And Dr. Harkin also attempted to do this post-war. And there's an ancient Arab saying, not a surgeon who has not killed a patient. So at Hahnemann Hospital, Bailey started out with a 37-year-old male who died on the table. He operated next to a 29-year-old female who died 2 days post-op. And at that time, the Hahnemann said, that's the end of that. No more of that stuff. So he went down the river to Wilmington, Delaware, and operated on a 38-year-old male who died on day 5. Well, then it got to be pretty well known that he was not being successful. So he waited for about a year, and he then scheduled 2 patients on the same day, one at Philadelphia General, a 30-year-old male who died on the table, and a 28-year-old female at Episcopal Hospital who was miraculously different. I mean, she got better, was walking in 2 days, went on to have further children, lived in the 2nd floor, walked up, etc., and lived for 38 years. Dwight Harkin, now the surgeon who sort of invented this ability to go in and out of the heart, at Harvard, succeeded a week after Bailey with the same procedure, but he had lost 6 of his first 7 patients before. So this was the beginning of over 800 microvalves reported by the good doctor. And this operation was still being done at the hospital at the University of Pennsylvania in 1960 by a surgeon called Julian Jefferson. But it was the first time you could approach a heart problem and do something about it. Nowadays, if suitable, a catheter is used to do the same operations, pass from the leg through the right atrium and penetrate the interatrial septum, and the balloon is placed across the mitral valve. This balloon is in the left ventricle now, and then you blow it up and you can crack open the valve with the balloon valve also can leak. In other words, this valve is not opening in microcirrhosis, but there are a variety of diseases that cause this valve not to leak. The liquids get floppy, excessive, don't meet or shrink or whatever. And this gadget, called the microvalve, was invented. What it does is we again penetrate the interatrial septum from the leg. The red is the regurgitation of the blood coming back out of the ventricle, which it should. Pass this little clip down. It's coated with like a gauze so that it will cover with skin inside the heart, or epithelium inside the heart eventually. So you clip it in the middle like this. And now that big hole is reduced to two smaller holes and the valve doesn't leak. You can actually put 2 or 3 valve clips in. The first interior of the heart hole was the atrial septal defect. That's the top 2 chambers of the heart has a hole, which actually we need when we're in utero, but we don't later on. But the hole can be too big. So how do you approach something like this? You can't just stop the heart because we all know the brain gets damaged very, very quickly. But up in Minnesota, they knew that these groundhogs would do very well. Take their temperature way down, their heart rate went way down, and obviously their brains were working fine because they get up in the spring and run all around and chase each other, etc. So hypothermia seemed to be protective of the heart, and surgeons then tried this on dogs, and they found that if they took the temperature way down on a dog, you could stop his heart for 10, 15, sometimes 20 minutes. And so John Lewis did 20 atrial septal defects. This was a repair that could be done rather rapidly, 5 to 10 minutes or so, stopping the heart. This was the first open heart surgery done involving hypothermia, 1952. John Gibbons is a different story. He was at Jefferson Hospital in Philadelphia, and he actually devoted his life long before he did his first operation, 15 years, trying to develop a heart-lung machine, a machine that would do the duty of the heart and the lung, so you could open up the heart and repair what needed to be repaired. His first patient they put on the heart-lung machine died. He opened the right atrium, and there was no atrial septal defect, a lack of correct diagnosis. There was another problem that caused the patient to die. But his second patient was a total victory. He said, when I opened the right heart and there was an atrial septal defect to be repaired, it was the happiest moment in his life. And the patient ran 26 minutes without any circulation to her brain, other than the heart-lung machine. And this was the big door that opened cardiac surgery. And he operated on 2 more children. Unfortunately, they both died, and he never operated on another patient. This is Dr. Gibbons with his first and only successful patient. Ventricular septal defects, or holes in the bottom part of the heart, represent a more difficult problem. These are higher pressure chambers. The walls are thicker to be sewn, and the conduction system, the electrical system, runs right near these places. So these patients often had conduction difficulties immediately after, or sometimes even permanently after trying to repair these things. And it took a longer run, a longer time, but the heart stopped. So Dr. Lillihei figured out, well, you know, the mother has a placenta that does all this work for her infant in utero. Well, why not use the mother or some other relative to act as a heart and lung and take their oxygenated blood out of their femoral artery, run it over to the patient, take the patient's blood that runs back and put that in the mother's or volunteer's vein, and you could stop this heart and repair things inside. And he did 45 of these operations successfully. There were a lot of early mortalities and difficulties with conduction diseases and other things like that. And the worst thing was that one of the patient's mother was the donor for the period of time, 15, 20 minutes it took to close this thing. And she got an air embolism through the vein return that went to her brain and became, quotes, a vegetable, close quotes. And that was pretty much the end of this combined surgery. But this is a film of his operating on a small child. This is the heart, this is the incision, and he's repairing a tiny hole that's in here that's difficult to see. Valve insufficiency. Some valves are not, don't close well. This is the big valve coming out of the heart. Your heart, the big pumping chambers here, pressure 180 over 20 in this patient because the blood is going out, and when the heart relaxes, this valve should close and seal. But in aortic insufficiency, the valve doesn't close well, and the blood falls back into the heart, only needing to be repumped out again. So the pulse pressure is very high. The heart tries to get all its blood out, and a lot of it falls back. And so instead of being a one-way valve, this leaks back. And this was a common disease. And the first approach to this was by Dr. Hofnagel, a Notre Dame graduate. He developed this plastic valve that was put in the descending aorta. The heart would be down here, is the aortic valve. The blood would all come out, and the ball would go down, and blood would be able to go down to the lower extremities, but as soon as this heart relaxed and the blood started to fall back, this ball would go up. And it would be made out of plastic, so it would go click clack, click clack, click clack, click clack, and you could hear these things 25 feet away. How these people ever slept, I don't know. One of my partners trained near where this Dr. Hofnagel was putting these valves in, and he'd say when you had cardiac clinic, they'd have 15 people sitting there, click clack, click clack, click clack. But it did seem to happen. But the legacy of Gibbons was that he started to work with IBM, and they got a more sophisticated pump, and the Mayo Clinic took over really the further development. And this machine, called the Gibbons Mayo heart-lung machine, was what we had at University of Pennsylvania in the early 1960s. And this machine, the blood would come from the patient here through a roller pump reservoir where if you needed to add blood, you could add blood here, but you could just give it directly to the patient. And then the blood would run up into this chamber here where oxygen would interface with the blood, so reducing the lung effects. Anesthesia was given through the machine to this blood going back now to the patient. And this thing was huge. It was 8 feet long, we'll say 4 feet high. As I recall, there was hot and cold water lines running to it so you could control the blood temperature and the patient's temperature thereby. And when we would schedule a valve, aortic or a microvalve, we would type and cross 10 units of blood for every patient that we must take to the OR. Some of it, of course, parked in this machine. But it allowed us the freedom, allowed the surgeons the freedom of going in and sewing in valves. Started was an early valve, mechanical valve. Later on, so-called pig valves, tissue valves were started because of the less problem with anticoagulation. But it took a long time to sew in one of these aortic valves. This is a big valve going in the aorta. And just to give you an outline, this corrugated pipe here is the blood from the two atria, the right atrium, superior and inferior vena cava, and that corrugated pipe goes out to the heart-lung machine. And the return line is here. It's hard to see. It's over here going into the aorta, which is cross-clamped here to keep blood from coming back to the body. And then you could operate on the heart and sew the aortic valve into the aorta right here, and then close the aorta. But there was no hurry anymore. You could take an hour or so to do these because the heart-lung machines really work well. But it's still a big incision in the chest, a lot of recovery. Elaine Crevier came along in 2002 and developed a tissue valve that could be mounted on a balloon. So it would go into the femoral artery down here at the leg and put it in the position and blow up the balloon. Here's a very tight calcified aortic valve. And you cross the valve, sometimes very difficult thing to do, blow up the balloon. And this thing, the metal would sort of grab the side of the aorta. And you would be able to have a nice big opening and a competent valve. Some of the newer valves are what we call self-expanding. They don't even have a balloon. You just remove the sheath and they expand in place. And if one of these valves goes bad, you can actually go down and put another valve inside this valve. So Christian Bernard did the first heart transplant, although the technique was developed in the United States. The patient received a 25-year-old heart of a woman in an automobile accident. He lived 18 years 18 days before he died of rejection. This garnered tremendous publicity and turned loose 100 transplants in the following year. But very soon it became evidence it is not doing the surgery that is the problem. It is rejection of the transplanted heart. It took another 4 or 5 years before safe and reliable transplants could be done. By the way, I have an asterisk on transplant because actually the first heart transplant was done by Dr. James Hardy. And it involved a 90-year-old black man who had amputation of his foot, heart failure, etc. He was offered a heart transplant and accepted it. But it turned out that what he got was a chimpanzee heart, and he never got off the table. When Dr. Hardy went to the transplant meetings to present this case, Dr. Paul, I believe his name is, the first surgeon to transplant a kidney, put it up his hand. He said, "Doctor, before you give a talk, I want to know the answer. Do you keep the chimpanzees and the blacks in the same cages?" But heart transplants are about 3,500 a year now, 2/3 of them in the United States. And we used to pack them in ice, but now they're transported working. The story of Earl Bakken is an amazing thing. He was an electrical engineering graduate. He worked part-time at the University of Minnesota repairing their EKG machines and things like that. And the pacemakers were available at that time, external pacemakers. When the surgeons would do an operation, they would leave wires attached to the heart that they could pull out later when the patient wouldn't need the pacemaker. And they hooked them up to a machine plugged into the wall. Well, thunderstorm came along, knocked out all the electric in the ward. 3 people were on pacers, and all 3 of them died. So Lillehei, who was the doctors, went to Earl Bakken and said, "Look, I need a pacemaker that runs on batteries." So, well, there wasn't any such thing. So he gets Popular Electronics and he finds there's a metronome drawing using transistors, and he adapts it and makes this unit here the first pacemaker made by a small company called Medtronic. And they do about $30 billion a year now, and that's how Earl Bakken got started with the company Medtronic. Their first real product was this, a wearable external pacemaker that we would put a wire into the jugular vein, and put it in the heart and bring it out. And we would send the people home with this little thing and bring them back every 10 days or so. They change the batteries in this unit. I always put, it took 2 batteries. I always put 4 batteries on the table in case I drop one on the floor, trying to get it in. This is the first person to get an implanted pacemaker, put in 1958. The first one lasted 6 hours. They put in the second one, it lasted about a day and a half. The third one was a charm that lasted almost a year. He got a total of 26 pacemakers over 43 years that he lived, and he outlived both his surgeon and cardiologist. Pacemakers is, got smaller and smaller and more sophisticated. This one would drive both the top and bottom part of the heart, and it was, the size of a couple of poker chips. This is the newest pacemaker from the trial, now put in by a catheter from the leg, and taken down the apex of the right ventricle. It actually has little claws on it that are difficult to see. And you program it from the outside, and as soon as it's working like this, you detach the catheter and take it out. These are said to run about 7 to 9 years, and the patient, of course, walks home. There are some people who can't do it, and they said, I wouldn't survive the surgery to implant pacemaker. So, sudden cardiac death has been known for a long time. The first thing that I could find was blowing smoke up the ass, which I thought was an unusual approach. But there's this kid that has the bellows and the tobacco and everything you need. And in the 1930s, this doctor would attempt to stimulate the heart by taking a needle with a couple of wires, etc., and didn't record much success. In the 1960s, I think those of you who are my age who were in the business probably did this. I did it twice. Take a patient who was, quotes, too good to die, and cut open his chest between the 4th and 5th ribs, and go in and pump on the heart. I can tell you 2 things about this procedure. 1, it doesn't work. And 2, it hurts your hands and wrists like hell to be pressed between 2 ribs that don't want to be pressed apart. Defibrillators came along in 1947 at the Cleveland Clinic. A patient having an operation on his chest where the sternum is compressed way back, called rectus excavatum. Was in the OR and had the onset of ventricular fibrillation, and in the basement there was research going on in dogs, defibrillating dogs who were in ventricular fibrillation. And the unit was brought up from the basement, and by some miracle was able to generate a normal rhythm out of ventricular fibrillation. And this is what ventricular fibrillation looks like on the EKG, just a bunch of squiggles, no pumping action, and the shock is here, and then regular rhythm, top part, bottom part of the heart, top part, bottom part, and it goes along. This is the fellow who built that machine. He was a doctor of engineering, not a doctor of medicine, and he's got a very interesting story further on. In 1954, he was working on dogs and noticed that when he put the defibrillator paddles on the dogs, that a pulse was to be seen in the arterial tracing that they were using for research to know what the dog's blood pressure was. And a dog was fibrillated by accident while he was being prepared for these experiments, and the defibrillator was 7 floors away at Johns Hopkins, and Hopkins elevators are notoriously slow. It took 20 minutes for someone to go down and get the defibrillator, and during that time, Copenhagen kept pumping on the dog's chest with the paddles, and the dog was fine when they defibrillated him, and they published soon after that 20 patients who had cardiac arrest, 70% correction of rhythm, and with this, CPR was born. That is, that you could keep somebody alive in ventricular fibrillation until the defibrillator got there. So, first guidelines came out in '66 and '08, hands only, which way increased the number of people who were willing to give CPR. I actually always did mouth to nose. I don't know whether that's better or worse, but kissing some of these people was not my cup of tea. This slide I always show because Charlie Miller is a friend of mine. Every year, I've talked here for 11 years, I think. He says, Dave, you going to show that slide? So, it's the only slide he remembers from home. defibrillators came along in late 1980, and they were pretty big, and you had to make an incision in the chest and put the leads on the chest and tunnel them down into the abdomen, and the hockey-sized defibrillator sat down here. And these were put in by the heart surgeons, and typical of heart surgeons, we always test these to see if they work. So they would call the cardiologist to the operating room, and we'd come in, and the surgeons would get the paddles ready to defibrillate the patient. And they would say, please make a note that the patient is transferred to Dr. Zonies' service. And then they would shock the heart into defibrillation, and we'd all sit there for 5 to 10 seconds while the defibrillator figured out there's something going on that I have to do something, and then bang, it would fire and convert the patient back to regular heart rhythm, and the surgeon would say, transfer the patient back to my surgeon. Charles Dotter is a radiologist, and he was actually the first cardiovascular interventionalist. He had this patient, an 83-year-old diabetic female, who was at bed with severe pain, and he was asked to study her artery by the surgeons to find out what level she should have her amputation. So here's the artery coming down, it's essentially totally blocked here. This is the knee. So she would have to have, even though this is what she could see, she would have to have an above-the-knee amputation, which she refused. So Dotter said, well, let's see what I can do. So he takes this totally blocked artery, and he takes this very small catheter, goes through it, and opens it up, puts a little bigger catheter in, and opens it up a little bit more. And 2 weeks later, studies her, and it still was open. And this is the first artery that was ever opened by a physician. And several months later, this is the way the foot was, and she died 5 years later, always telling everybody, I'm still walking around on my 2 feet. So back in those days, there was a very common disease, rarely seen nowadays, angina pectoris, or pain in the chest. And it was due to atherosclerosis, where the arteries to the heart would be severely blocked. And although there was enough blood going through here at rest, when these people exercised, they would get chest pain because the downstream part wasn't getting enough blood. And these two guys are the guys who invented coronary artery bypass graft. I won't go into a long story, but it's really this guy's story here. Favalaro was Argentinian, came up after being in practice in Argentina, went to the Cleveland Clinic, said, I'd like to learn to do heart surgery, couldn't speak English. They said, we'll let you work as a technician, but you can't touch any patients, etc. 2 years later, he was offered a fellowship in cardiac surgery, and 2 years after that, he was offered as a place on the staff at Cleveland Clinic. He was a fantastic guy. He, however, went back to Argentina, where he did thousands of coronary artery bypass grafts. Unfortunately, because of the downturn in the government again, he committed suicide. But the fellow standing next to him is the guy who really invented coronary angiography, and Mason Soames, by accident, shot dye into a right coronary artery, and the patient survived, and he realized, well, we could look at all these arteries and try to repair them. And with Favalaro, developed the main bypass of this disease, coronary artery bypass grafting, which later got accelerated using the internal mammary artery, and that's the reason we don't see angina. Heart attacks early on were treated with oxygen. If you manage to survive it, the candy lady come back to the But this is actually what happens. Over years and years and years, coronary atherosclerosis begins to close off your artery. Around here, you might begin to get angina with exertion. But a heart attack actually is when this thing ruptures like this, and the body thinks there's a hole in your artery and makes a clot and totally closes off the artery to your heart. And way back when, this is a study of a patient I did in 1980, came in with an acute inferior wall myocardial infarction, sweating, terrible shape actually. Took him to the Cath lab, and inject dye into his right coronary artery, and it's totally blocked. This is the artery that runs the pacemaker in the heart, so he had a very, very slow heart rate. We had him on medications to speed up his heart. But in those days, we didn't have balloons, we didn't have stents, and we used clot-dissolving medicine, intracoronary streptokinase, to dissolve clots. And you can see that in about 20 minutes, there was now some flow established distally. You can see a clot sitting here, and a series of clots in here between where it was totally blocked. And 1 hour later, it's hard to see any disease in this. It's now pretty clear. You can see this is a big pack. He was very happy, and I was very happy. But this fellow developed the technique for patients who had really severe stenosis after their heart attack, putting in a little balloon. He did the first procedure in 1977, made this balloon in his kitchen. And in 1980, he was convinced to come to Emory University. I went, spent a week with him in 81 and 82, and started doing balloons at our hospital. Unfortunately, he died in 1985 in an airplane accident. He was a much better cardiac catheterizer than he was a pilot. But this is what he introduced. We could take something that was severely narrowed, open it up, but we found out that 30% of them would recur within a year, and so we started putting fencing in after we opened them up. And here's a patient with severe narrowing in the left anterior descending artery. This is the big widowmaker, as they call it. Narrowed here to here, really. And this side branch was a problem because if we try to work on here, we could close off and lose this big side branch. So the first time we studied this patient 6 years before this, he had minor narrowing here. We didn't do anything. So we came back 6 years later to this and put in a stent, a big stent across here. And at the same time, the second balloon in this side branch was wire piece available. And we ended up with that. And, he's actually here in the audience. I have to pay him $10 every time. Atrial fibrillation, irregularity of the top part of the heart. You get clots in the heart, clots up here, and they can migrate through this valve and go up anywhere into your head and produce a stroke, into your abdomen, cause dead valve. All in all, bad thing. We try to electrically stabilize the heart, but sometimes it doesn't work, so we get the catheters out and we go across. And most clots form in this thing called the left atrial appendage, and we put this little umbrella in it, and here's the appendage, here's the umbrella fitted in. This is right after it goes in, and it endothelializes or it gets coated with internal skin, as we call it. And it's a very effective gadget. Abdominal aortic aneurysms is another thing we've taken away from the surgeons. We used to have to get a graft put in like this, but now this can all be done with the catheter in the leg, and there was just a big study in the circulation journal showing that it's safer to do this either electively or emergently when this aorta starts to leak. You can still do this faster and with less trauma and death with opening surgery. Sorry, surgery. So thanks to catheters and x-rays, we're able to do this. Coming back for lunch, Tiger? You know. That's where we go. So that's modern cardiology. Do you have any questions?
Hear me? Okay. Thank you. I have 3 aortic valve replacements and have read a lot about them and everything. And until recently, I've been reading that the surgically installed valves were still superior in performance and durability, but that the internally done ones like interventionalists, are improving and improving. Has it yet come to the place where the interior installed valves are as good or better in performance and durability as the surgical? Because the cardiologist would tell me that if you're healthy enough, the surgical was better, and blah, 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 blah. So has it caught up or passed, or what's the status?
Yeah, let's say it this way. It's difficult to answer that question, but we're now accumulating a lot of data about tissue valves. Some people seem to tolerate big valves or other animal valves very, very well. It's certainly a heck of a lot easier to have one of these things put in. I mean, you can put one of these things in. Sometimes they'll put them in over right here with an incision at your throat, and go down into the aorta, put the valve in, and you can get up off the operating table and walk to your room. No incisions except one right here. Some of them are put in through the chest over here on the side. Again, the recovery is so much easier. And the mechanical valves, you need to take a drug called Coumadin. And Coumadin is a nightmare drug. You have to go get blood tests regularly. You can get too thin blood, you can get not a thick enough blood, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But when I was young, I always said, give me a Star Edwards valve. That's one of the first mechanical valves, because we would see these tissue valves deteriorate rapidly, the first generation in particular. I think they are much, much, much better. And it also depends on, are you 40 years old or are you 82 years old? If I was going to get a valve, which I actually have aortic stenosis, I'm probably going to get a valve sometime or other, I'm going to get an animal valve because I don't want to be fussed around with. I don't want to have my chest chopped open. I'd rather have something put in from my leg. So I think it depends on your age, mostly. If I was 30 years old and needed a valve, I would get a valve.
Yeah, Dr. Zonies, where are we going with this, with the kind of medicine that you're talking about? Great strides have been made, obviously, over the last decade or two, but I'm thinking of stem cell replacement and whatnot. Is there any hope that that can be done with the heart?
Well, there's certainly a lot of hope, but I still get all the cardiovascular journals. I haven't been struck that there's really successful research being done by infusing live cells into the myocardium. And you can show that a few of them will grow, but I don't think this right now. It's on the near horizon for something that will be.
One other question: where else in the world is there any kind of research being done that's even comparable to what we have in this country? Is it something that we see elsewhere?
Well, the French came up with a tissue valve on a balloon, Crepier. I actually went to France to learn how to do it. And a quick side story. I go to the hospital where he is, and they were supposed to have one of these patients to be done that day. There were complications. The patient wasn't done. So I hung around the Cath lab, and I said, well, how many cases are you going to do today? They said, that was the only one. I said, gee, it's not unusual for me to do 13 cardiac caths in one day. He says, yes, but you get paid for every one.
Thank you for the information. I have AFib, which I understand a good part of the population does have. They've, of course, medicated me with Pradaxa. You've indicated a possibility of an operation to do that. When would you differentiate between the two procedures?
I kind of skipped by. Atrial fibrillation is probably nowadays best approach if it's a recurrent thing. And if you have a suitable atria, in other words, it depends a lot on how big the atria is, why you're in atrial fibrillation, how well controlled can your blood pressure be, and other things like that, the valves. If we can do an electrophysiologic study, and burn the tract where this dog running around chasing his tail, as I call it, the best thing to do is to try that if that's possible. then if that fails, is the Watchman a good thing to try? I think you would reserve the Watchman maybe for people who have had repeated emboli, despite being on anticoagulants. And there are some people who just don't take medicine, even professional people, fail to take their medication. So, people like that, you might use a Watchman. But still, with a Watchman, you still need to take drugs. But they're less, it's not you don't have to take drugs. It doesn't work for everyone.
You have a building code for that?
Building code, no.
No.
I never
Yes,
put
sir.
a Watchman in.
I'm 82 years old, I'm in good health, I've never had any heart problems to my knowledge. I get an annual physical, and the only testing done for my heart is Dr. holds a stethoscope to my chest. Would you recommend any type of procedure to find out if something's sneaking up on you that you don't know about?
This is what I do when a doctor who doesn't know me puts a stethoscope on my chest through my shirt. I say, how's my shirt doing? Well, at 82, I would guess it depends on the background. Did you have hypertension? Do you have diabetes? What is your family history? What are your chances? I have two sisters. One is 92 and the other is 94. They both play bridge every day. Their minds are unbelievably clear. And I figure I'm unlikely to have brain problems. But I do have aortic stenosis, and someday or other it's going to have to be fixed. What do I do to follow my heart? I see a cardiologist every 2 years. Of course, I see a cardiologist every morning in the mirror. I go and we get a treadmill and things are checked up. I really electively had a cardiac catheterization before I retired. One of my buddies was retiring. I did him, he did me. Because I wanted to know, really, how are my arteries? And fortunately, they weren't bad.
One area that you didn't talk too much about is the mechanical heart. I mean the mechanical heart that is self-serving. As I understand it, the only success they've had to date has been with left ventricle assisting devices.
Right.
How do you see that as a potential option or
Well, one of our vice presidents had an external heart, and those really, work well. I mean, look at him. He looked like a best door 10 years ago, and he's still hanging around. But the totally implanted hearts, that's something different. First done by Ventricular, been done by a variety of people. The first ones were actually mounted on the outside. I mean, the tubes came out through the chest wall, and the thing was there but the thing about it is, God makes a better pump than any United States government. So I don't think there's a near future for total mechanical hearts.
Yeah, I've got three subjects. One, degrees, second, atrial ablation, and the last question on the heart pump. First, the guy that you mentioned first, whose name escapes me, the doctor, had killed, had 5 or 6 deaths, and he had a JD after his name. I'm just wondering if he had so many deaths that he had to protect himself.
No, that was Dr. Bailey, and he was an amazing guy, really. I mean, to have the chutzpah, I would say, to schedule 2 people the same day, and when he knew that it was the end if he didn't succeed, having killed 5 people. Later in life, he was involved with litigation. So he figured, well, you know what, I better go learn about this. So he got his JD later in life and actually served as a consultant, as I do, for lawyers. I actually have 2 children who are lawyers. I work for one. Which is nice that I get paid by my son.
Second subject,
ablation back in 2002, which has been good for me, and you didn't cover it.
Ablation is a terrific procedure when it works. Unfortunately, particularly if your left atrium is rather large, it doesn't work. They are getting better and better at it. I think these electrophysiology, we call them the electric guys. I think certainly if I would have had atrial fibrillation, I would have an ablation first.
Okay, third subject. Why does the heart pump twice the blood through its circuit? Why doesn't it just pump once?
I had an embryology teacher at Notre Dame who said the first day of embryology, he said, the final exam is going to be design a heart with other than 4 chambers and provide how it would provide it in embryology. And if you got 95 going into the exam, you didn't have to get a final exam. Believe me, I got a 95. But I had no idea how to design a better heart than God did.